Now, Professor, in the evidence that you gave the last time, and certainly from the evidence that has already been led in this matter, the issue of saturated fats and as compared to non-saturated fats is an issue that's alive in this matter. Would you be able to comment on that, Professor?
Again, since our last meeting in February, Mrs. Yeltsin-Stratum also published on News 24 an article, and this is the article. So recall that I spent quite a lot of time in February discussing the failure of the diet-heart hypothesis, and Dr. Harcombe and Nina Teichhold will spend more days on that, so I'm not going to extend it, but all I want to say is this is what Ms. Stratum wrote some weeks after, in fact in September, despite the fact that she had listened, or she should have listened, to all the testimony that we gave. So strong evidence shows a direct relationship with high saturated fat diets and raised LDL, the bad type of cholesterol, and that is contentious because I showed you yesterday that in our population where we changed them to a high fat diet, LDL cholesterol actually came down. So as a result, recommendations are that saturated fat should be limited in the diet to less than 10% of total dietary energy per day. And again, that conflicts with all the evidence that I've presented. So then she says, this advice remains despite some studies reigniting the debate. Now this is crucial, what I've written in yellow. The supposed controversial finding of these studies, and now she's referring to new studies which suggest that saturated fat is not dangerous, arose simply in emphasis because of the poor quality of the studies with methodological problems and small sample sizes, and not because previous research previously done is inaccurate. So what she's saying is, when the evidence, I don't agree with the evidence, I just say it's poor quality and we move on. And that's not what you're meant to do in science. You look at the evidence, and if the evidence changes, you have to change your opinion. And it's clear to me that she is saying, I'm not interested in the evidence. It's bad evidence. And that's not the way science should be. And this is terribly important because she describes herself as one of the most prominent people in dietetics in South Africa. And so if she's leading the field and she can't change her mind, then that's, on the basis of the evidence, that's a problem for me. This is now, to get back to the context again of why did we think that saturated fat was so bad for us and that sugar wasn't so bad? Now, Anahad O'Connor is the investigative journalist for the New York Times who exposed Coca-Cola as funding scientists across the globe. And we went through that in great detail. And I'm very proud to remind you that Anahad O'Connor investigated Coca-Cola's funding on the basis of an article that Dr. Asim Malhotra and I had written in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, called You Can't Outrun a Bad Diet. And in that, we indicated that Coca-Cola was diverting the science to say that obesity was simply because people were not exercising enough. And it was because of that Anahad O'Connor went and looked into the funding where Coca-Cola was spending their money. And that exposed the massive funding of scientists in the United States and elsewhere. And as a consequence, Coca-Cola reduced their funding, stopped their funding completely for those organizations. So Anahad O'Connor didn't just stop there. Now he's reporting another study from the Journal of American Medical Association, which shows how the sugar industry in the 1960s funded scientists to come and say that sugar is safe and saturated fat is unhealthy. And this is what is written in the Journal of American Medical Association. The sugar industry paid scientists in the 1960s to play down the link between sugar and heart disease and promote saturated fat as the culprit instead. And these are shown by newly released historical documents. The internal sugar industry documents recently discovered by a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, and published Monday in the JAMA Internal Medicine suggest that 5 decades of research into the role of nutrition and heart disease, including, note, many of today's dietary recommendations, may have been largely shaped by the sugar industry. So one industry determined the dietary guidelines for us. And Professor Stan Glantz, who's professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco and an author of the paper, says they were able to derail the discussion about sugar for decades. So even though the influence peddling revealed in the documents dates back nearly 50 years, more recent reports show that the food industry has continued to influence nutrition science. And last year, an article in the New York Times, and that is by Anna Had O'Connor, as a consequence of our investigations and what we'd written, revealed that Coca-Cola, the world's largest producer of sugary beverage, had provided millions of dollars in funding to researchers who sought to play down the link between sugary drinks and obesity, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, in this June, the Associated Press reported that candy makers were funding studies that claimed that children who eat candy tend to weigh less than those who do not. So that's the evidence for where the saturated fat story comes from and how it was distorted by industry. And I'm sure that Nina Teichhold will spend an enormous amount of time extending on that argument. And I just remind you that the South African sugar industry was one of the two main sponsors of the recent ADSA annual convention held in Cape Town in September 2016. The other main sponsor was the Medical Research Council of South Africa. Now, ADSA, at the same time, after the February hearing, wrote this: a joint statement on low carbohydrate diets for health and weight loss by the Nutrition Society and the Association of Dietetics. It has no author's name. So we do not know who wrote this. I do not know if Mrs. Yulsing-Strydom wrote this or contributed in any way. But I want to again draw the point that when the evidence is unpleasant or uncomfortable, ADSA says, well, we just will ignore it. It's not good science. This is the nub of the problem. So ADSA writes, the opinions that low carbohydrate diets are the best and the solution for obesity and many other illnesses arise from good marketing and public relations rather than good science. Now that's astonishing. So in other words, Professor Tim Noakes and the Real Meal Revolution, all they do is they're just good marketers and they know how to deal with the public and they spend millions marketing or something, and there's no good science in it. And that is entirely wrong, because as I showed you at great length, there's massively good science behind the low carbohydrate diet, and I confirmed it yesterday. So this is my frustration, that this is simply wrong. If you don't like the science, you can't just say it's bad science or it's good marketing. You know, I was driving to this morning, and there's a whole debate on the radio about the Banting diet. And so what does someone phone in? They say, well, of course, Noakes is not a professor. He's a fool, he's a fake, he's a quack. And instead of looking at the evidence, you know, we attack the individual. And that frustrates me. So, and ADSA shouldn't be doing this, because their job is to make the nation healthy. And they need to look at the evidence and not just to try and attack those people who are trying to do the job. So, while giving attention to the multiple underlying factors involved in obesity, we need to ensure that dietary recommendations for the public are informed by the best available up-to-date evidence and centered on healthy foods and dietary patterns rather than isolated nutrients such as carbohydrates, which is really interesting because their dietary guidelines are also focusing on an isolated nutrient as fat. You've got to avoid fat. So then when we talk about carbohydrates, then we're wrong, but they're right if they just talk about fats. The point I made yesterday about conventional advice for the management of diabetes, and as we've identified, insulin resistance, the key driver of insulin resistance is carbohydrates. And I want to show you that the conventional dietary guidelines and the conventional medical management of diabetes is failing completely. And it's finally been acknowledged. So when ADSA says there's no evidence for the low-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, this is the current state of the play. There are 54 randomized control trials comparing high carbohydrate and low carbohydrate, or as they say, low carbohydrate and low fat diets. And there's the evidence and the numbers and the outcomes. So to say that this is bad science is simply nonsensical. You have to go and look at all this evidence before you can make those sorts of public statements, which are misleading and untrue. So now if we can continue with the argument about the way we manage diabetes and how the diabetes management has changed radically amongst the people who really know what we're talking about. So this is an article in the New York Times, September the 10th, 2016, and it says, before you spend $26,000 on your bypass for your gut bypass bariatric surgery, you should perhaps consider this. And it's written by Sarah Holberg, who is a person who works with type 2 diabetes, and Osama Hamdi, who's probably one of the most influential men in the management of type 2 diabetes, and I'll come to show what he is. The authors say most doctors and the Diabetes Association portray diabetes as an incurable disease presaging a steady decline that may include kidney failure, amputations, blindness, as well as life-threatening heart attacks and strokes. So those, in my opinion, are all complications of insulin resistance and high carbohydrate diets. Yet the literature on low carbohydrate intervention for diabetes tells another story. So this is now the unconventional, the Twitter information on social media tells a different story. For instance, a 2-week study of 10 obese patients with type 2 diabetes found that their glucose levels normalized and insulin sensitivity was improved by 75% after they went on a low carbohydrate diet. And then they both, the authors say, at our obesity clinics, we've seen hundreds of patients who, after cutting down on carbohydrates, lose weight and get off their medications. And part of the argument is that that's all anecdote, and where's the science? But reality is, once all these anecdotes accumulate, they become science. And this is the point. Who's Osama Hamdi? He's the medical director of the obesity clinic program at the Joslin Diabetes Center, which is the center for diabetes management in the world. His specialty is endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism, and he has special interests in diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. And I had the privilege of debating him 3 years ago in the presence of low-carb people, David Ludwig from Harvard, Gary Taubes, who wrote the book Good Calories, Bad Calories, and Jeff Volek, who is the leading authority on the effects of the low-carbohydrate diet on blood ketone levels and on blood cholesterol and so on. And in that debate, I indicated to Dr. Hamdi that he didn't quite understand his physiology and he needed to go back and read the textbooks because he didn't understand what caused a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. He said it was fat in the diet. I told him it's carbohydrates. And since then, he has significantly changed his position on diabetes, not because of me or anyone, but perhaps because of that debate. And they continue. A low-carbohydrate diet was in fact standard treatment for diabetes throughout most of the 20th century when the condition was recognized as one in which the normal utilization of a carbohydrate is impaired according to a 1923 medical text. And we've made that point, that insulin resistance is an inability to metabolize carbohydrates. So why would you want to load people who are insulin resistant with more carbohydrate? When pharmaceutical insulin became available in 1922, the advice changed, allowing moderate amounts of carbohydrate in the diet. And that has changed more and more because as the dietary guidelines have shifted more from fat towards carbohydrate, we've encouraged our diabetics to take even more carbohydrate and to use insulin to regulate their blood glucose. So they say we owe our patients with diabetes more than a lifetime of insulin injections and risky surgical procedures. To combat diabetes and spare a great deal of suffering, as well as the $322 billion in diabetes-related costs incurred by the nation each year, doctors should follow a version of that time-worn advice against doing unnecessary harm and counsel their patients to first do low carbs. So there is the most important man in diabetes in the world, finally admitting that maybe we got it wrong and maybe we should move to low carbohydrate diets for diabetics. And I refer you back to our paper which we presented yesterday showing the benefits of a low carbohydrate diet for people with the metabolic syndrome.